Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick, as always. Over there on the other side of the screen, if I'm pointing the right way, I think I am. There's Evan.
Maybe I'm pointing this way too.
Maybe,
We
yeah.
just pointed. We just pointed out outside to the
There we go.
to the comment boxes or the other suggested videos.
Yeah, yeah. How good day to you, sir, Evan. Let's
Good
get
day
that
to you,
off.
sir.
Yes.
We got to get that right away.
Yeah, of
We
course.
missed that a couple episodes ago, but
We did.
that's all right. Our dedicated listeners will catch it. Maybe
we did. Since we're still in Genesis 2:15, the third part of our trilogy, let me just read that real quick. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it.
Excellent.
All right, so the last two episodes, right, we looked at what might be encompassed in this idea of working or cultivating the garden, the first word here to describe it. Mm-hmm. So today I want to take a quick look at what we might take from this idea of keeping the garden, and then look at the two ideas, jointly together. What kind of overlap, or what do they kind of mean in the full context of each other, right? So the word here being used, keep, this word is shamar. Again, I hope my pronunciation on that is right. But it's used elsewhere in the Bible for many different things. One of the more noticeable ones that it's used to describe the priest's role in guarding the temple. More relevant even is that the next chapter actually uses this word to describe what the sword that prevents a return to the Garden of Eden does. It's the same word. It's also the word that Cain uses when he asks, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It is used to describe the protection of sheep, and it's even used to describe the protection that God gives, right? All of these different things. So I think
interesting.
From all of that, we might look at all that sort of overlapping senses and get the idea here that the word is clearly associated with guarding and protecting something.
Yeah.
Right. And we talked about the idea of the word garden being related to guard in the English and the Hebrew, and that's clearly a component of this, right? Yeah. But here we see man as being placed in that role, actually.
What jumps out to me from that phrase, the way you've described it, is that it implies that there is something coming to get the garden.
That's exactly where we're going to go next.
There is something that, okay, fantastic.
Yes, wonderful. Way to see where we're going, right?
There is something threatening. Yeah.
Yes, the obvious question here, right, is from what, right? Yeah, if it's guard, protect, the question is from what? Now, the answer to that, I would say, if we're going to be pedantic, is to say whatever is outside of the garden, right? You're not keeping the garden, guarding the garden from itself. You're guarding the garden from something that is outside and beyond the limits of the garden. So we must consider what that must be. What is beyond the limits of this garden, right? Yeah. So for the answer to that, I think it makes sense once again to go back to the opening verses of Genesis chapter 1, right? Because we're looking at this as this story as a sequel, not necessarily chronologically, but symbolically a sequel to chapter 1. Yeah. And so if the garden here is a place where God's order is being established, right, then that which it must be guarded against, that which is outside the garden, again, not in a physical sense here, but more metaphorically, is the chaos and disorder, right? That which is without form and void that we saw in chapter 1. That is what we're guarding from. Mm-hmm. We're guarding from that chaos. We're guarding from that disorder, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the question that always arises, is, and we will get to this probably more in depth of when we get to it, but why is the dang serpent in the garden? And we will get to that more. But that's an obvious question that a 10-year-old could ask.
Right.
But why is that there? And we won't get into why, I think, right now, but I think it's worth saying, well, God warned man. Mm-hmm. God very clearly says here, or it's not a quote, I guess, but it's designated here that man's obligation is not only, it's threefold. It's to, we've talked about last time, to help things grow, to encourage them to grow, and then to also restrain them when they have overgrown. But then there's a warning inside of this saying there are going to be things that are going to come in to try to interfere with you doing that.
Right.
And there are going to be things that are going to try to cause trouble. That's interesting.
And the implication being and there are many rabbinic teachers and Christian teachers who have argued that, well, no, the first failure in all of this stems from not properly protecting the garden from the serpent being there in the first place. Right. And that being sort of the initial failure, if you will.
Yeah.
So I do want to dive into this a little further here, because it is then the purpose of man to guard against the chaos that waits beyond the garden, right? I want to take this idea and push it a little further. And we already talked about this a little bit in the last couple episodes, but the idea, I think this story and verse, right, particularly provide an accurate description of the reason for humanity's existence, the ideal purpose behind humanity's existence, right? And this description is, we'll note, is in absence of the effects of sin, right? We'll get to those in the next chapter, but right here, sin hasn't entered the picture yet, but you're still having to guard from this chaos and void. So when we then think about these things in in terms of like eschatology and the removal of the effects of sin, I think this particular issue remains.
Yeah.
I think there's something about this that remains, right? The effects of sin may be no more, but the threat of chaos and void that awaits outside of God's order, that threat remains.
Yeah.
And that means that it's still necessary to guard against it in the new heaven, new earth dynamic, right? The kingdom of heaven. So it's interesting to think that, we might be gardeners without sin, but we still must guard the garden, right? And we talked a little bit about that idea of people not thinking about work in the ideal version of humanity, right? And in this sort of this new heaven, new earth, the post the return of Christ, the effects of sin being wiped away. No, you'll have to work, right? We talked about that. Clearly, that's a part of it, and this too is a part of it. And it's interesting to think. We think of evil being wiped away or whatever, and it's not that. It's not destroyed. It's just perhaps we'll be better guards, at that point. But the necessity of guarding the garden still exists, I guess. And so that goes the same, by the way, for cultivating the garden, right? That will be a necessary thing to do as well. And so these words, I want to point out too that these words I don't think they describe the past of humanity without any connection to the future. I think they describe the future of humanity as well. Because they describe the best of what humanity can hope to ever be. They describe humanity fitting that role, playing their perfect place within the boundaries that, they're meant to exist within God's creation, if that makes sense. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Thoughts on the future necessity to guard the garden still?
Well, the pushing, even just the pushing into the future, I think is significant, because you hear the critique. I think the fair critique of a Christian worldview as being like eternity is unsustainable. That eternity sounds like a hell in and of itself. And it feels like that comes a lot of times from the place of saying, well, of paradisio, of eternal non-function. Yes. Eternal mai tais on the beach, eternal I don't even drink Mai Tais. I should clarify that.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had a Mai Tai, to be honest. But I don't like fruity drinks. But, eternal whatever drink of choice
Sure.
on the beach doing nothing. And that's not what ever conceivably is presented. I don't know of a place where that's presented in scripture. And what is presented far more often is one of function. And function is appears to be something that we are created for.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, yes, the necessity of guarding is important, but even just taking both of these and taking them as forward looking and saying, look, this was the assignment from the beginning, and it appears the assignment that we continue to maintain. So that function won't get old.
Right.
I think that's significant, and that's at least the part of an answer to that reasonable pushback of saying, like, look, paradise, that doesn't sound wonderful. That sounds like I can't even comprehend eternity, and that sounds horrible.
Yeah. So my notes from where we go actually follow that concept, right? That you're talking about. Because if we look at these two ideas together, I think we do have a tendency to see the Garden of Eden, as you're talking about, as some kind of stasis, right? Where Adam and Eve were meant to like repeat the same kind of activities day after day for eternity. And the only reason that didn't happen was the clock of that was broken by sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a mistake to see it that way.
Yeah.
And I think what we see in this story, right, and the description here in this verse, even more particularly, is the idea of a status quo being a fallacy.
Yeah.
And things must be either growing closer to God's order, which, by the way, I would argue is infinite, just as he is infinite. Like, I don't think we'll have reached that point where everything is perfectly ordered as God wants it to be, because I think he is infinite, and therefore the order that is also infinite. We talked before about this idea of creation being a way to better understand God through creation. We can never fully understand God, but if by the process of bringing in things deeper and deeper into his order allows us to understand him more and more. But if he is infinite, then therefore that ordering process must also be infinite. But
can I give an illustration?
Yeah.
Potentially,
go ahead.
Because I think this is the place to do it. Is I hear this critique often given about marriage. You hear of people, classic critique of it is dull. It is the same person. It's people might say they've had an exciting dating life, and they've met tons of different people, and they've enjoyed many different partners, all that stuff, and they're like, marriage is going to be boring because it's going to be stasis, like being described. And I have heard so many people, especially those who get married older, who've experienced what that kind of ideal looks like, and then let's say, 30 actually isn't old to get married nowadays, I guess, but far north of 30 have get married, and they'll say things to the effect of, I'm shocked, but I love being married. They're like, I didn't think I would enjoy this, but this is so incredibly enjoyable. And because it's a lack of understanding that, like, well, what appears outside to be stasis is actually, and that's not to say marriages can't go wrong, but in properly done is actually very active.
I would in fact say
continually reinventing itself.
They go wrong by treating it as stasis. I mean, a sure way to cause conflict is assume you have your spouse all figured out.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is because you're wrong. You haven't figured them all out. You don't understand them completely. You don't, right?
Yeah.
And that is a sure way to create conflict and division. So that's I think actually one of the easiest ways for marriages to go wrong is the idea that it is, some sort of status quo that is ongoing in some sort of stasis, right?
Exactly.
So this idea of growing closer to God's infinite order, right? That is living. That's what living is. That's what allows access to the tree of life, is doing that, right? At the same time, though, right? Again, there is no status quo. What this tells us is cultivate and keep, and you don't cultivate, you're not growing towards God. You don't keep, you're going to go the other direction, right? Things are going to fall out, right, of God's order. It's going to become more like the chaos that it's not being guarded against, and this is that is the nature of death, right? Mm-hmm. And so we return again to this example, and I think God gave us a wonderful example in biology, that we have this idea that something is either growing or dying. It's one or the other. Even something that appears to maintain a status quo, that to me is just that is an illusion. It's merely that chaos and order are somehow in balance with each other, right? And strangely, there is a desire sometimes for that, right? But that's not what we're meant to do. Not even that. We're not even meant to seek this balance between chaos and order. No. You grow and you guard against it. You cultivate the growth and you keep the other one away. So that way you're always moving more towards God's infinite order. The balance thing, the balance is it's a compromise between good and evil, and a compromise between good and evil, only evil gains. I think that's actually a Ayn Rand quote, weirdly enough, an atheist coming up with that. But we might think of in a compromise between chaos and divine order, it's only chaos that gains, right? The idealism of the yin and yang concept is a lie. And it's a lie told by chaos and evil, because that's all that's needed for it to stave off defeat. It doesn't need to win, it just needs to stave off defeat. And I would even go a little bit further. It's probably more than we have time for a full discussion of here. But I would actually say that I think this idea of appealing to balance is about pushing us to desire a status quo, which keeps us from growth, right? If you're remaining in status quo, you're not growing. And that's not good. You need to grow more and more in terms of in God's order. But the desire for a status quo actually appeals to the thing within us that is meant to address the boundaries that we talked about in the previous episode, right? The need for boundaries, the need to enslave things. And I think we have that innate instinct to want to find the right boundary, right? And maintain that boundary. But that is not the same thing as balance. That is a different thing. The boundary is the ideal spot where the thing can grow and become the maximum of what it can be, not this point at which there's just enough chaos left in. Because if you do that, if you find this balance where you're letting in just enough chaos, you let in the serpent. That's what happens. So you need to cultivate and grow while keeping and guarding and keeping the serpent out. It's both things. It's necessary to do both things in order to advance God's order as we're sort of designed to do, right? Yeah. So any thoughts on that? The attack on the yin yang concept?
Yeah, I don't want to get us too far down a tangent, because I think I look at chaos as perhaps in different terms. I don't look at whatever else is outside the garden as chaos. And I think of the yin and the yang. If I were to apply it in this context, I would think of it along the lines of our previous episode with the previous word, of thinking that's the boundary line. Actually, that's the point where chaos and order step in, because I think of classically as chaos being the process of growth, because growth is oftentimes a step into the unknown. Yeah, I know we hear a little puppy in the background.
Little puppy noise. That's all right.
Yeah, right. Chaos is typically a step into the unknown, which is fundamental to growth.
I think it is. I think it is because of the effects of sin. I think that's true. I think that, yes, there is a way in which it's a step into the unknown. But if you've set proper boundaries, sort of you have faith in sort of what the unknown is, You have faith that there is order in the unknown,
no, I think
not chaos.
That's where I think the limits are established, and that's why I see the yin and the yang being more rightly applied there, as saying that's the point at which order steps in, is the point at which you set the boundary and say, no, it's not going to go beyond here, because that's the overtaking of chaos and stepping into territory where it's not intended to step into. But within the confines, the cultivation process is
right.
I mean, I referenced,
but each thing is, my point is, each thing is ordered. There's no point at which chaos is in there. Each thing is ordered. Each thing has its place. Each plant in the garden has its place next to the other one. There's no point at which we have a plant here and then we have a little bit of chaos and then we have another plant here, right? That's not the idea of the garden. The idea of the garden is we have the plant here, and then we have the plant here, and we have the plant here. We don't have plant, chaos, plant, right?
Yeah.
It's not,
I see what you're referencing.
It's not that kind of a setup.
I think this is I don't know if it's a longer discussion.
I'm
not sure if I have.
In a way, you're kind of getting, though, to what I'm getting at, right? Like the appeal to the yin and yang is again, it's about the boundary thing, right? The boundary thing is, we have a natural instinct toward the boundary and understanding, no, this thing has its place and then this thing has its place and they're separate from each other, right? And then, I think that's what the yin and the yang is trying to appeal to, but it's saying, well, no, chaos has its place. Well, no, the serpent doesn't have its place, right? The serpent shouldn't be there in the garden. The serpent
but
is the
I would
error.
still even go back to the creation story. That's why I said this can easily get us down a rabbit hole, but I would go back to the creation story and say, look, God created the deep waters and then he brought land out of it, but he didn't get rid of the deep water.
And I'm not saying you don't get rid of the chaos. The chaos stays outside the boundary of the garden. It doesn't come into the garden. He didn't bring the deep waters onto the land then afterwards, or say, now I have the land, let's put a little bit of deep water right here in the midst of it, and a little bit of deep water here in the midst of it. I mean, that's not really the idea there. The idea is they're separated, right? Is the description. Yeah. And same thing, the garden is separated from the chaos. So there is ultimately a boundary at which the chaos is kept apart. But it's not that the ideal for how we should live is one that allows a certain amount of chaos and allows a certain amount of order in our lives. No, there is a order to be sought from all of it, and the chaos will exist, but it is our job to keep the chaos back at its boundary and have it not spoil the order. Right? See, the key to the yin and the yang thing is the eyes. The eyes where there's a little bit of the black inside the white and a little bit of the white inside the black. If you wanted to draw that without the little eyes, the little one inside the other, then I'm down with it, right? The problem is the little bit of the one inside the other, that's the serpent in the garden. That's the thing that spoils.
Yeah, but see, what I think is humanity lives on the boundary line.
We do live on the boundary line, which means we will certainly see the chaos, but that's not the same as letting the chaos in.
But it sounds like you're describing us going only into order. That's the thing. I'm
describing what was said is to work and keep the garden. I mean, it says expressly guard.
Yeah.
Keep the chaos out. Right. And now it may be that you venture forth to expand the garden, bring more of the chaos into order. I think that actually is where humanity is supposed to be doing, is to bring more of the chaos into order. That's the
elimination of all chaos. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I am suggesting is that I think just as God is infinite, just as there's infinite opportunity to order, the chaos likewise is infinite. God created the chaos. Mm-hmm. Why did he create the chaos? Yeah. Right? That's what's interesting, is he created that. He created the heavens and the earth. He created the waters. He created this chaotic element. Why? Yeah. Well, I think he created an infinite chaotic element because the more we bring chaos into order, not let chaos into the garden, but bring chaos into the order, that is the more we discover God through this process, the more we learn about who God is, with creation as a window into who God is. That is the process. But to do that, then chaos must be infinite. So you're not eliminating it. You're eliminating maybe that portion of chaos or that kind of chaos or whatever. But you're not eliminating chaos. Chaos is infinite.
Yeah.
Right. and also created by God, but it has its place outside the garden. And that's the key of what I think is being got at in this verse. So let's wrap up the idea as a whole. I think when we look at these ideas combined, what we're really seeing is that to advance God's order, the sort of the purpose of man, as we talked about at the end of kind of a big payoff potentially at the end of the previous episode. What is the purpose of man? It is to advance God's order forward while guarding against the chaos which lurks just beyond the garden, just beyond the limits of the garden. And by doing those things rightly, we bring things further and further into the divine order of God, and thus further and further understand who God is. And so for me, I see this verse as describing that as sort of the summation of the purpose for which man was created, to be gardeners, if you will. And that is why I argue that perhaps this is the most important verse in the Bible. We'll see. That you could argue a lot of ways on that, but that's my personal take on what might be the most important verse in the Bible. Hence the 3 episodes that we took on this one. So, all right. With that, we will be back diving into the next few verses. We're actually going to talk trees again, which is fun. We get to return to that subject as God explains to man here his relationship with the trees. So we'll look forward to that. If you want to make sure you get all of these upcoming episodes, be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're on. Also, if you could hit a like, a comment, a review, a subscribe, a 5-star, a rumble, whatever it is, feel free to do that. That always helps with people discovering the show, as well as mentioning it to any friends you think might be interested, or enemies. If you have an enemy who you think might be interested.
People say they have enemies. Is that a thing?
I don't know.
Do you walk around? Do you describe anyone in your life at the moment as an enemy?
Oh,
that you personally know.
That I personally know. I personally know people who may take on the role of enemy from time to time. Let's put it that way. I think it's presumptuous to throw someone in the camp of, total enemy, total my enemy, neighbor or friend or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I think there are people that take on the role of enemy from time to time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I like that. That. I don't know if I have anyone that I would describe as enemy. I don't know if I did. I definitely in grade school thought of people as, there are certain people I thought of as enemies.
As enemies, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I see people just filling that role. It's not like they're not my enemy all the time.
They're the enemy at the moment.
Yeah, the enemy of the moment, right?
That's fair. I like that.
I see. Send this to your enemy. I see people in various positions as enemies. Let's say various bureaucrats
as enemies. Well, that's why I said personally no. I'm thinking more so just like the stereotypical image of like the suburbanite who's got the neighbor who builds his fence just a little bit into his yard,
something like that.
Yeah. That's the real enemy I'm looking for.
Yeah, not owning a home, I suppose, mitigates some of that possibility. But
I guess you could have the loud neighbor.
You could. I think I've got a kid that's 5 and 2 and 2 dogs.
So you're other people's enemies.
I was going to say, so
that's what you're saying.
We are the loud neighbor, right? That's for sure. I don't think anyone else is the loud neighbor in all this. We are definitely the loud neighbor.
There we go.
So yeah, I would allow for that.
That's what you do. So send this to your loud neighbor. That's what we're asking.
Exactly. Yeah. If you've got a loud neighbor, or a boundary dispute on where your fence needs to be or something like that, perhaps share the show with them.
Exactly.
Give them a look. Email as well, unschooltheology@protonmail.com. If you want to share with us who your enemies are, actually, feel free to just send them into that email address. I'd like to know. We
could have a whole episode on that, just sharing people's
sharing who people's enemies are. Yeah, I would like to know what it takes. I mean, look, the Bible says love your neighbors and your enemies, right? And it doesn't say, interestingly, it doesn't say don't have enemies.
Yeah.
right? It sort of says, no, you'll have enemies. You will have people who are your enemies. You're supposed to treat them the same as your neighbor.
Yeah.
But like categorically, they may be your enemies, which is very interesting.
Find you an enemy.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people have some bosses that are enemies. So
I'm sure. Yeah. Or employees even.
Yeah, I guess that's right too.
Depending on the corporate structure you're in, it might be employees as well. But
the middle manager, you've got both. On both ends, you've got.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. There's nothing that the Bible sort of describes as immoral about having an enemy. You're good. You can have an enemy.
Yeah.
Just treat them the same as a neighbor. That's fascinating. I'm going to. Maybe I should cultivate some more enemies then, if we're allowed to.
Do you have to tell them they're your enemies?
I don't know. That's it.
Well, do you have a formal moment where you tell them,
or do you have to tell? Well, do you tell your neighbor you're their neighbor? Do you have to tell your enemy you're their neighbor? Are you lying if you do that? Is that then wrong? Where do we go with this? This is.
Well, they didn't ask you. I don't know if I'm ever going around saying like, "Are you?"
I was gonna say I don't need to. I guess I don't.
Do you need to tell someone like? And what would you do with that if you were on the receiving end? There's a whole thing here. To be continued.
I mean, I guess if they ask, you have to answer them truthfully, right? If someone asks you, "Am I your neighbor or your enemy?" then you would answer them truthfully, whatever side of that they're on. There you go.
No one's asking that.
I don't know. Maybe I need to do that. Actually, maybe I just need to go around and find it out. Hey, am I your enemy by any chance? Should we be enemies? I have a shortage of enemies in my life. Could I
just replace it with the word even nemesis? That would be even better.
I like the idea of Jesus saying, "Love your neighbor and nemesis."
It's more alliterative.
It's it is. I don't know if it is in the Hebrew, but or not Hebrew, I guess Aramaic.
Do they have a word for nemesis? I don't even know.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, how many languages don't obviously have perfect corollaries all the time? So I guess exactly. I'd like to know that. What language is most spiteful, right? Which language has the most terms to describe someone as your enemy? Then we know who are sort of, that's the people you watch out for. The people with that language where they've developed a myriad of different terms for enemy.
What if it's well, there's part of me that feels like it would be just like, like Belgium or something, because like they're always peaceful, but they always have people walking through their country. So maybe it's the country that's the most neutral, but they just happen to.
They would describe them as enemies. You think?
Maybe not enemies, I guess.
I think what would
they probably have the most terms for oppressor. Maybe that's what that might be.
Maybe, could be that. I don't know. But anyways, apologies for the digression here at the end of the episode.
But send us your enemy stories. If you have some good enemy stories,
we're curious. So send them our way, unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.